The Japanese claimed they sank her 4 times during the war, and every single time they were wrong. It took something no warship was ever built to survive. An atomic bomb detonated 500 yards away, underwater, sending a wall of radioactive seawater clean over her flight deck. Even then, she didn't go quickly. She held on for 8 hours, while the men who loved her watched from a distance, unable to help because the radiation would not let them get close. That ship is still down there right now, sitting upright on the bottom of a lagoon in the middle of the Pacific. Nobody is ever coming to get her. Her name was USS Saratoga, but the crew just called her Sarah. She was commissioned in 1927, and here is the part most people miss. She was never supposed to be a carrier at all. The Navy laid her down as a battlecruiser, a big armored warship designed for fleet combat. Then the Washington Naval Treaty came along in 1922 and put hard limits on how many capital ships each nation could build. The U.S. had 2 battlecruisers already under construction, Saratoga and her sister Lexington. Rather than scrap them, the Navy pulled the guns off, bolted on a flight deck, and turned them into aircraft carriers. It was one of the best decisions they ever made. Sarah was massive. Fully loaded, she displaced around 43,000 tons. She could push past 33 knots and carry 90 aircraft. And because she still had the torpedo protection designed into that battlecruiser hull, she could absorb punishment that would have destroyed later carriers. She spent the 1930s running fleet exercises and establishing herself as one of the most critical ships the Navy owned. When Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, Sarah was in San Diego, not in Hawaii. That stroke of luck meant she survived the attack untouched, and in those early desperate months of the war that mattered more than almost anything. A month later, in January 1942, a Japanese submarine struck her with a torpedo on her side. She took the hit, got patched up, and came back. By August, she was in the Solomon Islands, flying missions over Guadalcanal. Her plane sank a Japanese carrier. Then a second submarine found her and struck her with another torpedo. She survived that one too, went in for repairs, and returned to the fight. For most of 1943, she was the only operational American carrier in the entire Pacific. Just think about that for a moment. One ship, already nearly 20 years old, holding down the entire carrier mission across the biggest ocean on Earth. She hit the Japanese base at Rabaul. She covered landings across the Solomons. She was everywhere the Navy needed her to be. Then came February 1945, and she suffered her worst day of the entire war. She was stationed off Iwo Jima, providing air cover for the Marine assault. 6 Japanese planes came in low under cloud cover, and in 3 minutes, 5 struck her. Bombs tore through the flight deck. Kamikaze slammed into the hull and hangar bay. Fire broke out across the ship, and 123 of her crew were killed. She put out her fires, recovered her aircraft, and sailed all the way back to the West Coast under her own power. After that, the Navy pulled her off the front line and assigned her to train night fighter pilots out of Pearl Harbor for the rest of the war. By the time Japan surrendered, she had earned 7 battle stars. She had survived 2 torpedo strikes, 5 bomb hits, and multiple kamikaze impacts. Her service record read like a tour of the entire Pacific campaign: Guadalcanal, the Solomons, Bougainville, the Marshalls, Iwo Jima. But by 1945, the Navy had plenty of newer Essex-class carriers, and Sarah was considered obsolete. Nobody needed her anymore. You would think a ship that had been through all of that would earn a quiet retirement. She did not get one. In 1946, the U.S. military had a question it could not answer with theory alone. They had just dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan and ended the war, but they had no real understanding of what a nuclear weapon would do to a fleet of ships. Not on paper, physically. Would they sink instantly? Would they survive? Would the radiation make them useless, even if they stayed afloat? So they built an experiment. They gathered roughly 80 ships at Bikini Atoll in the remote Marshall Islands, loaded them as though they were ready for combat, and set off nuclear weapons in the middle of them. The program was called Operation Crossroads, and Sarah was one of the targets. She was loaded with fuel, aircraft, ammunition, bombs, depth charges, airdrop torpedoes, everything a working carrier would carry. Then she was anchored in the lagoon and the tests began. The first bomb, called Able, was dropped from a plane on July 1st, 1946. Sarah came through with minor damage, just a small fire on her flight deck from the heat. If you have been enjoying this story and want to see more deep dives into ships like Sarah, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which ship you want next. It really helps the channel grow, and I've got a long list of incredible wrecks to cover. The second bomb, called Baker, went off on July 25th, and this one changed everything. Baker was detonated underwater roughly 500 yards from Saratoga. The blast drove a massive column of water into the sky and sent a wave crashing over her entire flight deck. Planes, equipment, everything on deck was thrown loose. But the surface damage was not what killed her. The underwater pressure wave buckled her hull in multiple places below the waterline. Water started flooding in fast. Damage control teams tried to save her, but the radiation levels made it nearly impossible to send anyone below decks to seal the breaches. 8 hours after Baker, with her funnel collapsed across the deck from the force of the blast, Sarah slipped beneath the surface of Bikini Lagoon. A reporter on the observation fleet wrote that many of the men watching had served aboard her and desperately wanted to save her. She went down with no one on her decks. She settled on the bottom, sitting perfectly upright, exactly as a carrier should rest. The flight deck sits at about 90 feet. The bridge is accessible at around 40 feet. The bow reaches down to roughly 170 feet. And that is where the next part of her story begins, because unlike most famous wrecks, nobody ever made a serious attempt to bring her back up. The reasons are layered, and they all reinforce each other. First, and most immediately, radiation. After Baker, the entire target fleet was contaminated, and in the years right after the sinking, you simply could not work on the wreck safely. That concern faded over time, and today the site is considered safe for recreational diving. But by the time radiation was no longer the barrier, the strategic need had completely disappeared. The Navy had moved on to modern carriers and had no use for a design from 1927. There was zero operational reason to raise her. Then there is the sheer logistics of it. She is sitting in 170 feet of water in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest shipyard. Raising 43,000 tons from that depth would be a monumental engineering operation even under perfect conditions. And Bikini Atoll is about as far from perfect conditions as you can get. There is no port, no infrastructure, no heavy salvage equipment anywhere nearby. Everything would have to be shipped across open ocean, and the cost would dwarf the value of whatever scrap metal you pulled out. On top of all that, she went down loaded. There are still bombs on her hangar deck. Divers can see them sitting right there. Torpedoes, depth charges, rockets, 5-inch gun ammunition, all of it still scattered across the wreck and the lagoon floor. Any salvage operation would have to deal with live ordnance first, in a remote location, underwater, on a structure nearly a century old. And the deepest reason is the simplest one. Nobody owned the problem. There was no insurance claim to settle. There was no shipping lane to clear. There was no environmental pressure forcing anyone to act. She was just down there, and it was easier to leave her. Bikini Atoll became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010, and Sarah is the centerpiece of it. She is one of the only deviable aircraft carriers on the planet, and the experience is unlike anything else in the diving world. You descend, and you are looking at a flight deck stretching nearly 3 football fields. The aircraft elevator shafts drop into darkness below. You can swim through the hangar deck, the galley, crew quarters, and the machine shop. There is even a dentist office down there with the chairs still in place. The helm and navigation instruments are still on the bridge. A forklift sits on the hangar deck right where it was when she sank. Some of her aircraft are still there too. Hellcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers lie on the lagoon floor where the Baker blast threw them off the deck. Pilot gear is still inside some of them. Nobody has explored more than about 10% of her interior. She is so enormous that even experienced technical divers running multiple dives over a week can barely scratch the surface. New compartments are still being found. Coral and marine life have been growing on her for almost 80 years now, and the reef that is formed is part of the wreck itself. Raising her today would be unthinkable. She is a protected historical site. She belongs to the Marshall Islands. She draws tourism. She is a living piece of history that tells a story no museum display could replicate. The reasons to leave her grow stronger with every passing year, and the reasons to bring her up essentially do not exist. There is something almost poetic about the way her story ended. She took torpedoes and kept fighting. She took bombs and kamikazes at Iwo Jima and sailed home under her own power. She survived the first nuclear test with barely a scratch. Then the second one got her, not in a flash but slowly, over 8 hours, while the people who wanted to save her stood watching from a safe distance because the very thing that was killing her would not let them come close enough to help. She is still out there in Bikini Lagoon, sitting upright on the bottom, flight deck intact, bombs in the hangar, planes scattered in the sand around her. She was the ship the Japanese thought they had sunk 4 times, but never did. In the end, it took an atomic bomb to finally put her down, and even then, she made it take all night. She is not going anywhere, and honestly, she is more interesting right where she is than she ever would have been as scrap metal.